Today we're looking at one of the most intense political gambles in American history, the Compromise of 1850. Think of it as a nation hitting the snooze button on a civil war. But was it a stroke of genius that saved the country, or did it just delay the inevitable explosion?
I mean, seriously, how do you do it? That was the terrifying question facing the United States in the mid-1800s. The country was literally cracking at the seams, with the North and the South pulling in completely opposite directions over the explosive issue of slavery. And the answer they came up with was this huge, incredibly complicated package of laws. Now, it brought a massive wave of relief across the country, for sure. But, as we're about to see, it also planted the seeds for an even bigger, bloodier conflict just down the road. All right, let's get into it. So what exactly pushed the country to this breaking point? Well, it really all started with gold, westward expansion, and one simple request from the Pacific Coast. You see, after the gold rush, California's population just exploded. And by 1849, it was ready to be a state. They wrote up a constitution that flat-out banned slavery. This one request, simple as it sounds, threatened to completely shatter the delicate balance of power between free states and slave states that had held the country together for decades. And this right here, this really shows you the heart of the problem. You've got the North, increasingly industrial, wanting to stop slavery from spreading. And then you've got the South, whose entire economy and way of life depended on it, determined to protect and even expand slavery to keep their political power. If California came in as a free state, it would tip the scales in the Senate, giving the North an advantage. For the South, that wasn't just a political loss, it felt like an existential threat. Now, you'd think everyone would be scrambling to find a solution, right? But there was a huge roadblock, the president himself. Zachary Taylor, a famous war hero, was dead set against any big congressional deal. He basically thought Congress should stay out of it, and with him blocking any path forward, Washington was stuck in a total political stalemate. So, with the president refusing to budge, it was up to a true legend of the Senate to try and figure a way out of this mess. And that legend was Henry Clay. They called him the Great Compromiser because he'd already saved the nation from breaking apart before. He stepped up with this massive, ambitious plan, basically a bundle of different laws all wrapped into one bill. The goal was to give both the North and the South just enough of what they wanted to convince them to step back from the brink. But Clay's big plan was dead on arrival as long as President Taylor was in office. Then, in a wild turn of events, Taylor suddenly died in the summer of 1850. His vice president, Millard Fillmore, took over. And guess what? Fillmore was a huge supporter of compromise. This changed everything. Suddenly, the door was wide open to get a deal done. So what was actually in this big landmark deal? It wasn't just one law, it was a package of 5 separate bills. Let's break down this complicated give and take. Okay, this table really lays out the balancing act they were trying to pull off. For the North, the absolute biggest win was getting California admitted as a free state. They also got the slave trade, that is, the public auctioning of people, banned in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. Now, for the South, they got some huge concessions too. They made sure that the new territories of Utah and New Mexico could decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. That was called popular sovereignty. And the real kicker, they got a brand new, much tougher Fugitive Slave Act, which basically forced the federal government and even ordinary citizens in the North to help recapture people who'd escaped slavery. You could see it was a really messy, complicated bargain. So the bills passed in September of 1850, and the crisis seemed to be over. You could almost hear the entire country breathe this collective sigh of relief. The feeling everywhere was that the Union had been saved. People celebrated in the streets. It felt like the political system had actually worked, you know? Secession was off the table, and it really seemed like the country could finally move on. The new president, Millard Fillmore, said it perfectly. He called the whole thing a final settlement. And a lot of people truly believed him. They thought, okay, that's it. Crisis over. For good. Now you might be wondering, why on earth would the South agree to add another free state? Well, at first, the deal actually looked pretty good for them. First, they got that super strong Fugitive Slave Act they had wanted for years. Then, in a pretty shocking twist, California ended up electing pro-slavery guys to Congress. And on top of all that, New Mexico and Utah both passed slave codes almost immediately, suggesting that this whole popular sovereignty idea could easily create even more slave states. But that final settlement was anything but final. The compromise didn't actually solve the problem. It just kicked the can down the road and, in the process, created new problems that were maybe even more explosive.
Let's look closer at this idea of popular sovereignty. On the surface, it sounds great, right? Super democratic. Just let the people who live in a territory vote and decide for themselves. The problem was, in practice, it turned every new territory into a vicious political battleground. It was basically a recipe for disaster.
And it created this dangerous domino effect. Once the rule was set for Utah and New Mexico, just 4 years later, Southern politicians demanded the same thing for the new Kansas territory. The result? A mad dash. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, each side determined to win the vote. This led to fraud, threats, and eventually straight-up guerrilla warfare. It was a mini-civil war that became known as Bleeding Kansas. The compromise's solution had become a whole new problem.
And at the very same time, the South's biggest win in the compromise, that Fugitive Slave Act, it backfired big time. People in the North were horrified seeing federal agents snatching people off their streets and forcing them back into slavery. It brought the raw brutality of the system right to their doorstep. This radicalized thousands of moderate people, turning what had been a fringe abolitionist movement into a mainstream political force. It hardened opposition to slavery in a way nothing else ever had.
So in the end, the peace bought by the Compromise of 1850 was just paper thin. Yeah, it held the Union together for about 10 more years, but the real issues were left to fester and get even worse. The snooze button had been hit, but the alarm was just set to go off again, only this time way, way louder.
Which brings us to the big question that historians still argue about. Did the compromise just delay the Civil War, giving the North a crucial decade to grow stronger and more industrialized, making its victory more likely? Or did it actually make the war inevitable by proving that no political deal could ever fix a moral divide that was so deep? It's a tough one, and there's no easy answer.